The world ended quietly and without ceremony, so slowly that hardly anyone noticed the collapse until it was too late. It began with distant reports of failing crops in the south, mutated weeds choking out staple grains, and entire herds of livestock vanishing without explanation. There were rumors of superstorms that flattened entire farming belts, forcing large-scale evacuations. Global supply lines fractured under the pressure, and soon what remained of civilization discovered the truth. There simply wasn't enough protein to go around. People began eating whatever they could find, foraging city ruins for tinned goods, and eventually turning on one another out of desperation. That was when the newly formed consortium proposed the insect program as a last-ditched solution. Nobody dared to hope it would work, but enough influential voices supported it, and in a world bereft of options, enough was good enough. Decades later, the scarred earth wore the ruins of its cities like broken crowns. Across the horizon, rusting skylines stood as tombstones for a lost era. The only signs of life, besides the perpetually howling winds, were the narrow columns of smoke rising from small, scattered settlements. In one of these settlements lived a meager collection of survivors struggling to live day to day. They relied on a carefully engineered insect known as Proteon, an unassuming beetle the size of a thumb. It was one of countless genetically modified species that had been introduced after the Great Collapse, each designed to provide a dense source of proteins and oils. The insects consumed less water than traditional livestock, and could thrive in parched soil. Over time, even the squeamish learned to tolerate insect-based meals. Beyond that acceptance, an entire generation had grown up knowing nothing else. A single battered sign along the settlement's outer barrier, warning "Beware the wastes," reminded people of why they stayed cooped up within their meager domain. Inside the settlement's perimeter, half-broken fences and walls were constantly patched up to keep out roaming brigands, or worse. But it wasn't just about the violence anymore. Without the insects, the community would starve in a matter of weeks. They devised greenhouse tubes to house the insects, controlling temperature and feeding them scraps from the settlement compost heaps. A new type of protein farm was born from necessity. Men, women, and children performed daily tasks, cleaning the tubes, sifting eggs, grinding beetles into protein flour, and distributing rations. The scuttling legs and chirping wings had become a kind of lullaby to them, background noise that they barely registered but desperately needed to survive. Chewing on the bitter aftertaste of a dry proteon patty, Mara walked the perimeter of the settlement's greenhouse tubes. She was a young woman of about 25 and had never tasted real beef, pork, or chicken. The idea of a cow was something she'd read in old texts. She wore patched fatigues, boots scuffed to near disintegration, and carried a short blade strapped around her waist, a precaution in these uncertain times. Her real task was scouting for mechanical failures or structural weaknesses around the insect tubes. While electricity was an erratic commodity, the settlement had repurposed solar panels from dismantled cars and rooftops. These panels provided a feeble but steady source of power that kept the tubes at the correct temperature, and single malfunction risked the entire colony of proteons, so vigilance was crucial. Mara stepped over a coil of loose wiring and tapped a glass segment of the nearest greenhouse. The interior crawled with thousands of beetles, perched on rows of feed troughs, each thrashing into the next in a violent dance for sustenance. She knew better than to be squeamish. If even a fraction of these beetles died, the settlement would be thrust into a protein shortage too harrowing to imagine. The wind howled behind her, swirling dust around her boots. On the horizon, the sun seemed to shiver behind the thick haze of soot and pollution that still hung in the atmosphere, a relic of the wars and climate disasters that had devastated the planet. Sometimes, Mara tried to picture the stories of the past: blue skies, green fields, actual fruit. But it felt more like a fairy tale than history. She continued to inspect each greenhouse, occasionally pulling out a foldable toolkit to tighten a loose bolt or patch a crack. At the last greenhouse, she found Adam, the settlement's lead genetic engineer, his arms elbow-deep in a container of feed mix. Adam was older, maybe in his late 40s, and he bore the marks of a lifetime of worry on his brow. She greeted him with a nod, hinting at the uneasy tension that always lingered when they met. Adam was one of the few who understood the intricacies behind the insect's genetic modifications. He was also someone who believed the settlement needed to push the boundaries to ensure survival. "Any trouble?" he asked, voice muffled as he sifted a strange, powdery substance into a feed trough. "Nothing worth reporting," Mara replied, crossing her arms. "Heard that a neighboring settlement was overrun by marauders, though. Could be they'll come around here next." Adam wiped sweat from his brow. "We'll manage. We always do." His gaze drifted to the dense swarm of proteans inside the glass. "We have to." Days bled into weeks without any significant incidents, except that the insects weren't reproducing quite as quickly as they had hoped. Something in the environment was affecting their growth cycle, and every day, Adam toiled over lab samples, rummaging through data from old scientific archives that had survived. Mara, meanwhile, was wrapping up her nightly patrol when she caught wind of a rumor about a new black market trade. Unmodified insects that could produce more flavorful meat and might even lay eggs edible to humans directly. People whispered about ways of combining them with the proteons to create something that might replicate the texture of old-world proteins. Curiosity gnawed at Mara, so she sought out J.A. Merchant, known for finding exotic items from pre-collapsed bunkers. Jay's living space was a cramped metal container near the settlement's western wall, stacked to the rafters with salvaged goods, chip plates, tarnished silverware, solar battery packs that flickered on the brink of failure. Jay sat on a frayed mat, counting bundles of wire. When Mara entered, Jay looked up, flashing a tired but genuine smile. "You'll be interested in this," Jay said, reaching under a crate. Carefully, the merchant lifted a small jar with air holes punched in the lid, revealing a cluster of writhing, pale larvae. "Found them out in the wastes. They from an older strain of mealworm, I think. Pre-collapsed genetics, or so I've heard. Quite the delicacy if you know how to raise them." Mara frowned. "We rely on the proteons for good reason. We can't risk introducing a foreign insect that might compromise the entire crop. You know the regulations, Jay." Jay shrugged, tapping the jar. "Might be worth it if they taste better or breed faster. Some folks out there are ready to pay a lot, and word has it that they're more resilient to the toxic environment." Doubt flashed across Mara's face. On one hand, she didn't want to undermine Adam's carefully nurtured crops. On the other, a more diverse food source might mean fewer sleepless nights, wondering if a single plague or mutation would wipe them all out. "Keep them hidden for now," she said, nodding at Jay's find. "I'll think about it." That night, Mara struggled to rest. In her cramped bunk, she listened to the flickering hum of the settlement's meager power supply. Just a few blocks away, rows of insect greenhouses glowed faintly under artificial light. Her thoughts wandered to the memory of her father, who had died 2 years ago from diseases caused by malnutrition and exposure. He had always told her that the day would come when relying on a single insect species would be a liability, yet the settlement had put all its hope in one. As she lay there, eyes heavy, she decided she needed to talk to Adam. Early morning found Mara at Adam's makeshift lab, a repurposed trailer with reinforced doors and walls, lined with salvaged computers. Tangled wires connected outdated servers, while glass slides and vials cluttered every inch of table space. Adam, already awake, hovered over a microscope. The overhead light buzzed softly. He barely acknowledged her until she gently coughed. He set the microscope aside and turned to her. "Mara, you look troubled." She told him about Jay's contraband, the possibility of a new strain of mealworm. Adam's face twitched with subdued excitement and fear in equal measure. "Genetic diversity is important," he allowed, "but these wild strains can carry pathogens our modified beetles have never encountered. It could wipe out everything we've worked for." "Or it could save us," Mara countered. "You've seen how the proteons are breeding slower every month. We're on borrowed time unless we find another solution." Adam rubbed his temples thoughtfully. "If we do this, it has to be careful, contained. We'd need to isolate them completely and run tests before we consider integration. One slip-up could mean a total loss." Despite Adam's reservations, they agreed to see Jai about acquiring a few larvae for experimentation. Not wanting to alarm the rest of the settlement, they decided to keep the plan secret, fearing that rumors of a new potential food source might cause chaos or sabotage. Together, they arranged to smuggle the jars into Adam's lab under the cover of darkness. Several days later, they brought in the contraband mealworms, transferring them to a sealed terrarium in Adam's lab. With the skill of a practiced scientist, Adam began analyzing them under microscopes, sequencing what remained of their DNA with antiquated machines that whirred and beeped. Every so often, Mara would peek over his shoulder, trying to understand the data on the flickering monitor. She watched the grainy readouts of GCAT patterns scroll across the screen, a language far too complex for her to decode. Adam's apprehension was evident when he sat back in his chair, mouth set in a grim line. "They're heavily mutated," he murmured. "Whatever environment they survived in out in the wastes introduced some bizarre traits, but I can't figure out if they're dangerous. We'll need to raise a generation, see how they develop, whether they carry any parasites that might transfer to the proteons." Time wore on. Weeks turned into a month of clandestine research, and Adam isolated a promising brood of these older mealworms. They fed on a variety of leftover organics, and despite the high toxicity of the settlement's water supply, they continued to thrive. Mara noticed that these new insects had a slight luminescent sheen, especially at night, an odd but mesmerizing glow across their segments. It seemed harmless enough, maybe even beneficial if it indicated some adaptation to the environment's radioactivity. Meanwhile, the settlement's leadership grew concerned with the dwindling yields from the proteon greenhouses. Rumors flew that at least 3 settlements had fallen in the last month, 2 to raids, 1 to disease. Mara's friend Una, who worked as a guard at the eastern gate, mentioned that scavenger parties had spotted new, nameless shapes roaming the wastes at night, creatures that scuttled too fast to identify. Everyone grew more paranoid and jumpy. Tempers flared at ration lines. Reminders of the delicate stability weighed heavily on every conversation. Eventually, Adam saw enough promise in the old mealworm brood to attempt a hybridization experiment with the proteons. He believed that crossing certain genetic traits might increase the proteon's reproductive rate or resistance to environmental stresses, but the process required delicate gene editing. With each passing day, the risk of discovery grew, intensifying Mara's anxiety. If the settlement's council learned of the experiments, they might confiscate the insects or punish Adam, seeing it as a risk too great to permit. Nevertheless, Adam pressed forward, determined to find a breakthrough. Late one night, the first sign of real trouble emerged. Mara was returning from her perimeter patrol when, deep inside the tubes, a shrill screech rang out. It wasn't from a human, but from the proteons themselves, an eerie cacophony of insect chatter. She ran to the greenhouse complex and found a group of proteon keepers huddled around the main tube, flashlights in hand. The insects were swarming erratically, trying to climb the glass walls. A handful had already suffocated in the corners, stacked upon one another in a desperate attempt to escape. The keepers looked panicked, unsure what was happening. Fear gnawed at Mara's stomach. Could the older mealworms have infected them somehow? She swallowed and stepped forward, calling for calm. "Let's ventilate the tube," she instructed, pointing to an emergency hatch for releasing stale air. When the keepers obliged, the proteons eventually settled, although many were still restless, climbing over each other in a frenzied scuttle. None of them seemed to have changed physically, but a new tension hung in the air. Adam arrived minutes later, breathless and carrying his kit of instruments. "We need to inspect them," he said, kneeling by the tube's data readout. "Temperature and humidity are normal." He frowned, pressing a stethoscope-like device to the transparent panel. "No sign of infection, at least not outwardly, but they're definitely agitated." In the days that following the incident, the agitation in the proteons only grew. Where they once calmly ate feed and bred quietly, now they clashed with one another, wasted energy in constant motion, and laid fewer eggs. Some started showing signs of morphological changes, tinny horns on their carapaces, slight variations in color. Adam fretted that the unauthorized mealworms might have begun to cross-contaminate the environment, either by airborne spores or microparticles carried on clothing and equipment, even though they had taken extreme precautions. Mara felt sick with guilt for having started this chain of events. We have to consider culling the proteons, Adam said grimly one day. We can't allow a massive mutation to disrupt the entire settlement's food supply. Unless we find a way to reverse or control it, we might lose our main protein source entirely. Her voice trembled with frustration. You want us to kill our only food? That's suicide. Adam's face was gaunt with sleeplessness. If we don't, we risk letting a mutant strain breed out of control. We don't know how it will evolve, or if it'll remain safe for human consumption. Mara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the settlement's future pressing upon her. She thought of what her father had said, that relying on a single species was a mistake. Maybe the only way forward was to push onward with diversifying, even if that meant letting the proteins run their course. What if we focus on the new mealworms instead? She asked, the words tasting like treason. We keep them quarantined, breed them carefully, and if the proteins fail, we transition. Adam hesitated, wrestling with the moral implications. Then he nodded slowly. We'll try that. But we can't let the settlement council discover what we've done, not until we're sure we have a viable alternative. By day, Adam and Mara pretended to maintain normal operations, distributing the usual rations of powdered meatle meal. By night, they snuck into the lab and watched the new mealworms feed, grow, and metamorphose. To their relief, the brood stayed healthy, even robust. A handful finally pupated into adult beetles, smaller than the proteans yet quick and cunning, with a faintly glowing exoskeleton that shimmered under the lab's overhead light. Their egg-laying cycle was shorter, meaning potential for faster protein yield. The next generation would tell if the trait was stable. Outside, the settlement reeled from increasing unpredictability in the proteans. Fewer and fewer healthy beetle harvests arrived each day. The council began to suspect sabotage or disease, but they lacked the scientific expertise to pinpoint the cause. The rumor of genetically altered mealworms soon circulated, leaving people suspicious. Mara overheard a few folks calling Adam a mad scientist behind his back, accusing him of messing with forces he didn't understand. She turned a deaf ear, focusing on the job, ensuring the settlement survived no matter the moral or political cost. In a desperate attempt to avert disaster, the council mandated a communal meeting. Everyone gathered in the central plaza, standing on cracked pavement dotted with patches of hardy weeds. The air smelled of sweat and tension. The council chair, an elderly woman named Cass, stood on a small makeshift stage. She called for order, noting that the protein supply was at a critical point. She asked if anyone had knowledge of alternate protein sources or had been experimenting with new insects. A hush fell. Mara glanced at Adam. They exchanged uneasy looks. Before either could summon the courage to speak, an unexpected shriek echoed from the greenhouse tubes. People gasped as the ground vibrated under them. A low rumble that quickly escalated. A group of frightened children clung to their parents as more shrieks filled the air. Chaos rippled through the crowd. Shouts of confusion and fear rose as the settlement's perimeter alarm began to wail. Mara sprinted toward the insect greenhouses, heart hammering, Adam at her heels. Under the piercing floodlights, she witnessed what could only be described as an exodus. Countless proteons had burst from the tubes, smashing through weaker panels as if driven by some collective madness. They twisted and spilled across the settlement grounds, climbing buildings, scuttling past panicked residents. Their once docile forms now seemed warpsome, with elongated bodies, others sporting spikes. Adam seized Mara's arm. "They're trying to escape," he shouted over the din. "Or possibly searching for something." Within minutes, the insects spread through the streets in a crawling mass, devouring anything edible in their path. Cabbage patches, compost heaps, even smaller animals. Fearful settlers armed themselves with improvised flamethrowers or clubs, desperately trying to beat back the swarm. Mara summoned every burst of courage, directing people to safety behind the larger steel barricades of the storage depots. Amid the confusion, she remembered the lab where the new mealworms were housed, sealed in a terrarium. If the proteins found and destroyed them, that might doom the settlement for good. She and Adam pushed their way through the swarm toward the lab, fighting off insects that latched onto their boots and legs. The assistant caretaker, Ona, joined them, brandishing a metal pipe to clear a path. At the lab's entrance, they found a cluster of mutated proteons pounding against the door. Adam swung his improvised torch, scattering them, and Mara kicked the door open to find the interior in disarray. Computer equipment was toppled, containers shattered. The terrarium with the new mealworms lay intact, but fell on its side. Rushing in, Adam lifted it gently. The adult beetles inside skittered, slamming against the transparent walls. "They're still alive," he breathed, relief ghosting across his features. Outside, screams and the crunch of exoskeletons signaled the ongoing battle. "Mara, if the proteans are truly out of control, we might have only one shot at starting over," he said, voice trembling. She nodded and pointed to a storage crate. "Take them there, seal them up. We'll need to transport them outside the settlement. The swarm's too aggressive. We can't contain it unless we do a full purge." Adam grimaced at the word purge, but he knew he had no choice. The settlement's meager supply of propane and fuel would have to be used to torch every last protean. Adam placed the new beetles in a secure container, added a few handfuls of feed, and sealed the crate. Una helped them drag it outside through the chaos. In the following hours, the settlement devolved into pure bedlam. Mara and a handful of others consolidated their perimeter defense, forcing the swarm of mutated proteans into strategic kill zones. Homemade flamethrowers scorched the insects by the hundreds. Drones that had long been dormant were hurriedly reactivated to drop makeshift incendiary devices. The air stank of burnt chitin and chemicals, a toxic haze that lingered in every alleyway. It took nearly the whole night, but by dawn the swarm was reduced to charred husks. The cost, however, was immense. Entire sections of the settlement lay in ruin. Half the homes were gutted, gardens destroyed. Nearly all of the precious proteans had been eliminated. For better or worse, the people had survived, but they were left starving, battered, and uncertain. Council Chair Cass surveyed the devastation with a solemn gaze. "We have no food," she admitted softly. "Not enough to feed more than a handful of us for the next month." That was the moment Adam stepped forward, chest tight. Mara stood at his side, carrying the sealed container of new beetles cradled in her arms. We have another option," she said, glancing at him for assurance. "An alternative insect strain, quarantined away from the swarm. It could save us if we move quickly." Shocked murmurs rippled through the bystanders. Cass's eyes flashed with equal parts anger and hope. "You did this in secret," her voice trembled. Adam bowed his head. "I feared it would terrify everyone, especially if it went wrong. But after what's happened, it's our best chance for a future." The council was too desperate to argue for long. Within days, every able-bodied individual pitched in to establish a new greenhouse, smaller and more fortified, but hopefully enough to raise the new strain. Under Adam's guidance, they carefully introduced the glowing beetles into the environment, monitoring them around the clock. If this new species thrived without succumbing to the mutations that plagued the proteans, perhaps they could rebuild. And if not, it might well be the settlement's perfect doom. Sleepless nights passed as the new insects settled into their habitat. They ate, reproduced, glowed faintly, and caused no unnatural disruptions. After the first generation matured, their bodies were processed into test rations. Volunteers, including Mara, tasted them. The flavor was earthy, not unlike the proteons, but with a subtle, nutty aftertaste that hinted at something new, something that might, in time, become a sustainable cuisine. Eventually, the council acknowledged that these hybrid mealworms marked a fragile lifeline. They authorized the phased expansion of new greenhouses with strict oversight by Adam to prevent another catastrophic mutation. Over the months that followed, battered though they were, the settlement slowly found its footing. Families that had starved found renewed energy. Children no longer cried constantly from hunger, and people huddled around community fires at night, quietly hopeful. Mara stood again by the perimeter fences, gazing out at the wastes. The sunrise on the horizon, still muddy and red with dust, offered no grand spectacle, yet she felt a small flicker of optimism. Underneath her protective vest, she carried a container of seeds, not plant seeds, but the eggs of the new beetles. She planned to guide a small expedition to scout another location, far enough that if disaster struck here, some measure of hope would endure elsewhere. That was the lesson of the last few months. Diversity, caution, and preparedness. A quiet satisfaction settled in as she watched the settlement's battered silhouettes move behind the fences. Children were chasing each other with sticks, and a few of the machines hummed with the energy from solar panels. The time of lavish feasts was long gone, replaced by a new normal: insects for dinner. Yet within this stark reality, life went on. With each passing day, their future expanded one small step at a time, anchored by the combination of ingenuity, resilience, and the unassuming insects that now provided their daily bread.